Hi everyone, I'm Jess Blankshane. I teach in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Everything I'm about to say represents my own personal views, not those of my employer. Today, we're going to introduce the cognitive perspective. This is intended to complement your assigned reading from Chapter 4 of your Decision Making in American Foreign Policy textbook. As we've discussed previously, in this course, we use a number of analytical perspectives to isolate key actors and behaviors that help us understand foreign policy decision-making. Today, we're going to look at the cognitive perspective, which focuses on individual leaders making foreign policy by processing information and making decisions. We're staying at the individual level of our levels of analysis, looking at explanations of foreign policy that focus on the role of individual people. We'll start by talking about how real people make decisions in ways that systematically deviate from the expectations of the rational decision maker model that we previously discussed. And then we'll discuss the ways that the characteristics of specific individuals, their backgrounds, experience, personality, ideology, etc., shape the way leaders make foreign policy decisions. If you remember back to our discussion of the unitary state perspective, we imagined a hypothetical actor making rational decisions by combining their preferences and beliefs to make an optimal choice. Today, we're going to consider the ways that real people make decisions and how reality might differ from our hypothetical rational decision maker. We'll start by considering what it means for people's preferences to be non-rational in the sense that they are context dependent or inconsistent. Then we'll discuss ways that heuristics and biases systematically affect people's beliefs about the world. And finally, we'll talk about how people make decisions through processes other than optimizing. Our previous discussion of rational preferences, the idea that a rational decision maker can rank order their preferences over outcomes, may have seemed like a fairly reasonable assumption. However, in the real world, people's preferences are often non-rational in common ways. People's preferences, in particular, are significantly affected by the framing of a decision. For example, is the choice framed as a possible loss or a possible gain? This framing might depend significantly on the decision maker's perception of the current status quo. For example, in some experiments, people's preferences between two goods can change simply based on which good is randomly assigned to be theirs before they're asked about their preferences. In general, we find that people tend to view losses as more painful than their equivalent gain would be good, and to be risk acceptant when considering losses, more willing to gamble, and more risk averse when they're considering gains. People's preferences also frequently exhibit what we call dynamic inconsistency, valuing the present and the near future more than the distant future. For example, think about how much you'd be willing to pay for express shipping to have something you really want today instead of tomorrow. That's probably more than you would be willing to pay to have the same thing 10 days from now instead of 11 days from now, even though in both cases you're paying to decrease your wait time by 1 day. We also previously assumed that our hypothetical rational decision maker had unbiased beliefs that were updated as new information became available. But people's beliefs about the world frequently are biased in particular ways and are often slow to update based on new available information. For example, when people are asked to estimate a quantity or a probability, they often unknowingly use anchoring, availability, and representativeness heuristics. Their estimates are biased by extraneous information, things that happen to be easiest for them to remember, and how similar the situation is to other situations they've encountered. People also tend to be overconfident in themselves and their ability to understand and control situations. Overconfidence is connected to another common bias, known as the fundamental attribution error, assuming that bad outcomes are a result of unfortunate circumstances, while good outcomes are the result of our own good decisions. This further combines with what we call the affect heuristic, by which we often attribute bad intent to the negative actions of people we don't like, while we explain away negative actions of people we do like as caused by circumstances outside their control. In general, people try to avoid cognitive dissonance. This is a mismatch between their beliefs and the information they receive about the world. So to go back to the fundamental attribution error, if I believe Bob is a good person, I find it uncomfortable to accept evidence that Bob did something bad. So instead, I explain it away. People often engage in this kind of motivated reasoning, which allows them to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable trade-offs. For example, that choosing an option that would lead to certain good results would also require accepting certain negative consequences. And in particular, people are often subject to confirmation bias. They seek out and believe information that supports their pre-existing beliefs, while they avoid and discount information that does not match their pre-existing beliefs. And finally, as we began to discuss when we talked about the organizational process perspective, it is nearly impossible to make reasonably complex decisions through optimization. The human brain just can't consider all the costs and benefits associated with all possible choices. So instead, people make decisions by satisficing or using other cognitive shortcuts. One way that people make decisions is, as I said, by satisficing, choosing the first available option that produces a good enough outcome. For example, if you're trying to find a recipe for what to make for dinner, you might just choose the first recipe you find that uses ingredients you have available and has a certain number of positive reviews, instead of going through every possible recipe available to find the absolute best one. Satisficing for individuals can also take the form of cognitive scripts, which are a sort of individual analog to the standard operating procedures that we talked about organizations using. These are procedures that let us categorize and respond to situations more or less automatically, rather than doing a full decision process each time we encounter a new situation. People also sometimes make decisions using what we call polyheuristic theory. This is sort of a combination of satisficing and optimizing. First, they narrow down the available options using some heuristic, for example, narrowing down to only those policies that are likely to be politically acceptable domestically. And then among those remaining options, they conduct a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis to pick the best of the remaining options. And finally, emotions are another way that people simplify their decisions, making a decision because it feels right rather than because it's the result of some deep analysis. In particular, people often have a strong sense of fairness and reject divisions of goods that they see as unfair, even if that rejection means that they receive nothing instead of receiving the something they would have gotten with the unfair allocation. So, those are all cognitive factors that apply to all people making decisions. They're common patterns that we see in actual people's behavior. But why might one leader make different decisions than another? Are there reasons to expect that George W. Bush as president would make different decisions than Al Gore would? Or that Donald Trump's policies would differ from Barack Obama? An individual's personality and ideology might shape their preferences and the way they frame decisions and receive and process information. They may be more or less comfortable with cognitive dissonance and more or less open to new information. They may also be predisposed to view outcomes as gains or losses, as opportunities or threats. And an individual's background and experience also influence what cognitive scripts are available to them, how they categorize situations they encounter. For example, a leader with personal experience as a policymaker during the Vietnam War may view the potential for U.S. intervention overseas differently than one whose main policy-making experience was during the Gulf War. So to use the cognitive perspective to explain foreign policy decision-making, we need to combine our understanding of human decision-making in general with an understanding of the particular leader or leaders involved in a particular case. So we would ask things like, how is the leader likely to frame and categorize a particular situation? What heuristics and biases might shape their beliefs about the world? How are they likely to decide among options based on their beliefs? This means that, as with the palace politics perspective, applying this perspective can require significant insider knowledge about individuals, much more than we would need to apply, say, the unitary state perspective. And this challenge of understanding individual leaders and their decisions is not one just for the analyst. As Robert Jervis demonstrates in his classic article, Hypotheses on Misperception, one of the founding pieces of this sort of genre of cognitive and psychological analyses of foreign policy decision making, foreign policy mistakes often happen when leaders misperceive one another and their intentions, and particularly when they engage in mirror imaging, assuming that others see the world the way that they do, instead of allowing for the fact that different people may see situations differently. That was your brief introduction to the cognitive perspective. Next time, we'll move away from our focus on the analytical perspectives and the executive branch of the US government to talk about foreign policy making as two-level games. Thanks for watching.